Thomas Miller had been a palace guard for 12 years. Every morning he walked the same stone corridors, stood at the same golden doors, and watched the same wealthy people come and go. His life was simple and quiet, just the way he liked it. He had a small house outside the palace walls where he lived with his wife Sarah and their 8-year-old daughter Emma. Nothing exciting ever happened to him, and he was perfectly happy with that. The royal palace was huge, with hundreds of rooms, secret passages, and hidden corners that most people never saw. Thomas knew every inch of it. He had started as a young man, eager to serve the crown, and had worked his way up to become one of the most trusted guards. The other guards respected him, and even the royal family knew his name. He was the kind of person who did his job well and never caused trouble. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Thomas was assigned to guard the east wing of the palace. This was where the important meetings happened, where the king and his advisors discussed matters of the kingdom. It was considered an honor to be posted there, and Thomas felt proud every time he was chosen for this duty. The east wing was always quiet during the early morning hours, with only the sound of his footsteps echoing through the marble hallways. As Thomas walked his usual route, he noticed something different. There were more people than usual moving through the corridors, and they all seemed to be in a hurry. Men in expensive suits whispered to each other as they passed, their faces serious and worried. Thomas had seen these men before. They were members of the royal council, wealthy businessmen, and powerful politicians who advised the king on important matters. The morning passed slowly, and Thomas found himself growing curious about all the unusual activity. He had always been good at noticing small details. It was part of what made him such a good guard. Today, he could sense that something big was happening, something that had everyone on edge. The servants moved more quickly than usual, and even the other guards seemed tense. Around midday, Thomas was standing outside the council chamber when he heard raised voices coming from inside. This was unusual because the council meetings were typically very formal and quiet. He could hear the king's voice, which was deeper and more commanding than the others, but he couldn't make out the words through the thick wooden doors. Other voices joined in, and soon it sounded like several people were arguing at once. Thomas knew he shouldn't listen to private conversations, but he couldn't help being concerned. In all his years as a guard, he had never heard such heated discussions coming from the council chamber. He moved closer to the door, not to eavesdrop, but to make sure everything was safe inside. His job was to protect the royal family, and if there was any kind of threat, he needed to be ready. The voices grew louder, and Thomas could hear footsteps pacing back and forth inside the room. Someone slammed their hand on the table, making a loud bang that echoed through the door. Thomas had never experienced anything like this during a council meeting. Usually these gatherings were so quiet that he could barely tell anyone was inside. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived at the palace. Thomas watched as black cars pulled up to the main entrance, carrying men and women he had never seen before. They were well-dressed and carried briefcases, but there was something about them that made Thomas uncomfortable. They didn't look like the usual visitors to the palace. These people had cold eyes and serious expressions that seemed almost threatening. The new arrivals were escorted directly to the east wing, where Thomas was stationed. He nodded politely as they passed, but none of them acknowledged him. It was as if he didn't exist, which was strange because most visitors at least smiled or said hello. These people were focused on something much more important than being polite to a palace guard. By late afternoon, Thomas counted at least 20 unfamiliar faces in the east wing. The council chamber had been in use all day, with people going in and out constantly. The king had been inside for hours, along with his closest advisors. Thomas began to wonder if there was some kind of crisis happening in the kingdom that he didn't know about. As evening approached, Thomas noticed that the palace staff was acting differently too. The maids and servants who usually chatted and laughed as they worked were now silent and serious. When he tried to make conversation with Mary, one of the older servants who had always been friendly to him, she just shook her head and hurried away. It was as if everyone had been told to keep quiet about something. The day shift was almost over, and Thomas was looking forward to going home to his family. He had promised Emma that he would help her with her homework, and Sarah was making his favorite dinner. But as he prepared to hand over his duties to the night guard, he noticed that the council chamber was still occupied. Light glowed from under the door, and he could still hear muffled voices inside. Just as Thomas was about to leave his post, the council chamber door opened slightly. He quickly stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen standing too close. Through the small gap, he could see several men gathered around a large table covered with papers and maps. The king was there, but his face looked tired and worried, very different from his usual confident appearance. Thomas knew he should walk away and mind his own business, but something kept him frozen in place. His instincts told him that whatever was happening in that room was important, maybe even dangerous. As a guard who had sworn to protect the royal family, he felt he needed to understand what was going on. The meeting continued late into the evening, long past when Thomas should have gone home. He stayed at his post, telling himself it was his duty to remain until everything was secure. But deep down he knew his curiosity was getting the better of him. Something significant was happening at the palace, and Thomas Miller was about to become part of it, whether he wanted to or not. The night guard, Robert, arrived 30 minutes late, which was unusual for him. Thomas waited patiently, though he was eager to get home to his family. When Robert finally appeared, he looked nervous and kept glancing around as if he expected someone to jump out at him. Thomas noticed that Robert's hands were shaking slightly as he took his position. "Everything all right, Robert?" Thomas asked quietly. Robert just nodded quickly and avoided eye contact. Yes, everything's fine. You can go now." Thomas found this strange because Robert was usually talkative and friendly. They often spent a few minutes chatting about their families or discussing the day's events before Thomas left. Tonight, Robert seemed desperate for him to leave as quickly as possible. Despite his curiosity about the ongoing meeting, Thomas decided not to push the matter and began walking toward the exit. As he made his way through the corridors, Thomas noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The usual night lighting was dimmer than normal, and several hallways that were typically well lit were now shrouded in darkness. It was as if someone had deliberately reduced the lighting to make it harder to see what was happening in the palace after dark. Thomas knew the palace layout better than almost anyone, so he could navigate even in the dim light. As he walked past a side corridor that led to a servant's staircase, he heard footsteps above him. This was unusual because the servants' quarters were in a different part of the palace, and that staircase was rarely used at night. The footsteps were careful and quiet, as if someone was trying not to be heard. His curiosity getting the better of him, Thomas decided to investigate. He climbed the narrow stone steps slowly, making sure his own footsteps didn't make any noise. The staircase led to a small balcony that overlooked the main courtyard, but it also connected to a hallway that ran directly above the council chamber. Thomas had discovered this route years ago during his training, though he had never had reason to use it. When he reached the top of the stairs, Thomas could hear voices much more clearly than before. He realized he was directly above the council chamber, and the old building's acoustics carried sound up through the ceiling. He knew he shouldn't listen, but the tone of the conversation made him freeze in place. These weren't the usual diplomatic discussions he sometimes overheard. The voices were urgent, almost desperate. "The people will never accept it," someone was saying in a harsh whisper. "There will be riots in the streets." "The people don't have a choice," another voice replied coldly. "This is the only way to save the economy. The king's policies have failed, and we need decisive action." Thomas felt his heart begin to race. He had never heard anyone speak about the king in such a disrespectful tone, especially not inside the palace itself. In his 12 years as a guard, he had always believed that the king's advisors were loyal and supportive. What he was hearing now sounded like criticism, maybe even something worse. "But if we proceed with this plan," a third voice added, "there's no going back. Once we start, we'll have to see it through to the end, no matter what happens." "That's exactly the point," the cold voice responded. "Half measures won't work anymore. We need a complete change, and that means removing the obstacles that stand in our way." Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The word removing sent chills down his spine. These men were talking about obstacles that needed to be removed. And given the context of their conversation about the king's policies, Thomas began to fear the worst. "The international community will be watching," another voice warned. "We need to make sure this looks legitimate, like a natural transition of power. If it appears forced, we'll lose all credibility." "Leave that to us," the cold voice said confidently. "We have contacts in the media and the business community. They'll help us control the narrative. By the time the public realizes what's happened, it will be too late for them to do anything about it." Thomas felt sick to his stomach. He was beginning to understand that these men weren't just criticizing the king's policies. They were planning something much more serious. The word transition, combined with talk about controlling the narrative and making things look legitimate, could only mean one thing. These people were planning to overthrow the king. What about the military? Someone asked. We'll need their support if this is going to work. General Morrison is already with us, the cold voice replied. He's been unhappy with the king's military budget cuts for months. He'll bring the key commanders on board when the time comes. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. General Morrison was one of the king's most trusted advisors, a man who had served the crown faithfully for over 20 years. If he was involved in this plot, then the conspiracy was much larger than Thomas had imagined. How many other people in positions of power were part of this plan? And the timeline? Another voice inquired. 3 weeks, came the reply. We need to move before the autumn budget announcement. Once the king reveals his new economic policies, public opinion will shift in our favor. People will be ready for change and will be there to provide it. 3 weeks. Thomas felt his legs growing weak. Whatever these people were planning, they intended to carry it out in just 3 weeks. He thought about his wife and daughter at home, probably wondering why he was so late. He thought about the king, who had always been kind to the palace staff and had never done anything to deserve what these people were planning. The conversation continued, but Thomas found it hard to focus on the specific words. His mind was racing with the implications of what he had discovered. As a palace guard, he had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and the crown. But these weren't foreign enemies or random criminals. These were the king's own advisors, people who had been trusted with the highest levels of government. We should adjourn for tonight, someone said. We've covered enough ground and staying too late will attract attention. Thomas heard chairs scraping against the floor and realized the meeting was ending. He needed to get out of there immediately before anyone discovered him. He carefully made his way back down the narrow staircase, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Thomas saw shadows moving in the corridor ahead. The conspirators were leaving the council chamber, and he could hear their footsteps approaching. He quickly ducked into an alcove and pressed himself against the wall, hoping the darkness would hide him. 3 men walked past his hiding place, their voices low but still audible. Thomas recognized one of them as Lord Hamilton, the king's chief economic advisor. Another was Sir Richard Wells, the Minister of Internal Affairs. Thomas couldn't see the third man clearly, but his voice was the cold one that had dominated the conversation upstairs. After they passed, Thomas waited several more minutes before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were trembling, and he felt overwhelmed by the weight of what he had learned. He was just a simple palace guard, a man who wanted nothing more than to do his job and take care of his family. Now he found himself in possession of information that could change the fate of the entire kingdom. As Thomas finally made his way toward the palace exit, one thought kept running through his mind. What was he supposed to do now? Should he report what he had heard to someone in authority? But who could he trust when the conspiracy seemed to involve some of the most powerful people in the government? And who would believe the word of a simple guard against such important men? The cool night air hit his face as he stepped outside the palace, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. Thomas Miller's quiet, simple life had just become very complicated, and he had no idea how to handle what he had learned. Thomas arrived home almost 2 hours late that night. His small house on Maple Street felt like a sanctuary after what he had experienced at the palace. Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen, her face showing both relief and concern. She had prepared his favorite meal, but it had grown cold while she waited. "Thomas, where have you been?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. "Emma waited up as long as she could, but I finally had to put her to bed. She was so disappointed that you didn't help her with her homework." Thomas felt terrible about missing time with his daughter, but he couldn't explain why he was late without revealing what he had discovered. He had never kept secrets from Sarah in their 15 years of marriage, and it felt wrong to start now. But how could he tell her that he had stumbled upon a plot to overthrow the king? How could he explain that their peaceful life might be about to change forever? "I'm sorry," he said, holding her close. "There was extra security needed at the palace tonight. I couldn't leave my post." Sarah looked at him carefully, sensing that something was different about him. She had always been good at reading his moods, and tonight she could tell he was deeply troubled about something. But she also knew Thomas well enough to understand that when he was ready to talk, he would. Pushing him would only make him withdraw further. They sat down to eat the reheated dinner, but Thomas barely touched his food. His mind kept replaying the conversation he had overheard. The voices, the words, the implications. Everything swirled around in his head like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Sarah watched him push his food around on his plate, growing more worried with each passing minute. "Thomas, are you feeling all right?" she asked gently. "You look pale and you're not eating." "I'm just tired," he replied, forcing a smile. It was a long day, but Sarah wasn't convinced. In all the years she had known him, she had never seen Thomas look so disturbed. Even when he had to deal with difficult situations at the palace, he usually came home with stories to tell and a hearty appetite. Tonight, he seemed like a completely different person. After dinner, Thomas went upstairs to check on Emma. His daughter was fast asleep, her homework spread across her small desk. He looked at her peaceful face and felt a surge of protectiveness that was stronger than anything he had ever experienced. Whatever was happening at the palace, he had to make sure it didn't hurt his family. Thomas sat on the edge of Emma's bed, watching her sleep and thinking about the future. What kind of world would she grow up in if the conspirators succeeded in their plan? What would happen to families like his if the government was overthrown? He had always believed that the kingdom was stable and safe, but now he realized how quickly everything could change. That night, Thomas barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the cold voice talking about removing obstacles and controlling the narrative. He thought about General Morrison, who had seemed like such an honorable man, now revealed to be part of a plot against the crown. How many other people in positions of trust were involved in this conspiracy? The next morning, Thomas got ready for work as usual, but everything felt different. As he put on his guard uniform and checked his equipment, he wondered if he was walking into danger. The people who were planning the overthrow knew the palace inside and out. They would be watching for any signs that their secret had been discovered. At breakfast, Sarah noticed that Thomas was even quieter than he had been the night before. She poured his coffee and sat down across from him, studying his face with growing concern. "Thomas, I know something is wrong," she said firmly. "You've been married to me for 15 years and I've never seen you like this. Please tell me what's happening." Thomas looked at his wife's worried face and felt torn between his desire to protect her and his need for someone to talk to. The burden of what he knew was becoming too heavy to carry alone. But if he told Sarah the truth, he would be putting her in danger too. The conspirators had made it clear that they would do whatever was necessary to protect their plan. "Sarah, I need you to trust me," he said quietly. "There are some things happening at work that I can't talk about right now, but I need you to promise me something." "What?" she asked, reaching across the table to take his hand. "If anything unusual happens in the next few weeks, if I'm late coming home, or if I ask you to take Emma and visit your sister, I need you to do it without asking questions. Can you promise me that?" Sarah's eyes widened with fear. In all their years together, Thomas had never talked like this. He was always calm and steady, never dramatic or mysterious. For him to speak in such serious terms meant that whatever was happening was truly dangerous. "Thomas, you're scaring me," she whispered. "What kind of trouble are you in?" "I'm not in trouble," he said, squeezing her hand. "At least not yet. But I need to know that you and Emma will be safe no matter what happens." Emma came downstairs for breakfast, her school bag already packed and her hair neatly braided. She was excited about a science project she was working on, and chattered happily about her plans for the day. Thomas watched his daughter's innocent enthusiasm and felt his resolve strengthen. Whatever he decided to do about what he had discovered, his family's safety had to come first. After breakfast, Thomas walked Emma to school as he did every morning. She skipped along beside him, talking about her friends and her teachers, completely unaware of the turmoil in her father's mind. When they reached the school gate, she gave him a big hug and ran off to join her classmates. Thomas watched her disappear into the building, wondering if everything would still be normal when she came home that afternoon. The world seemed so fragile now, as if it could shatter at any moment. He thought about all the ordinary people going about their daily lives, completely unaware that powerful men were planning to change everything. On his way to the palace, Thomas made a decision. He couldn't keep this secret to himself any longer. He needed to find someone he could trust, someone who would believe him and know what to do with the information. But who could that be? Most of the high-ranking officials at the palace were either part of the conspiracy or couldn't be trusted to keep quiet about what he had learned. As he approached the palace gates, Thomas thought about Captain Williams, the head of palace security. Williams was an honest man who had always treated the guards fairly and had served the crown faithfully for 20 years. If anyone could be trusted with this information, it would be him. But what if Williams was also part of the plot? What if Thomas's attempt to do the right thing only revealed his knowledge to the very people who were planning the overthrow? Thomas showed his identification to the gate guards and walked through the familiar corridors toward his assigned post. Everything looked the same as always, but now he saw potential threats everywhere. Every person he passed could be a conspirator. Every conversation could be about the plot he had discovered. As he took his position in the East Wing, Thomas noticed that the council chamber was already occupied. The same men who had been there the night before were back, along with several new faces. The meeting that he had thought was ending was apparently continuing, which meant the conspiracy was moving forward even faster than he had realized. Thomas stood at his post, trying to look normal while his mind raced with possibilities. He had less than 3 weeks to decide what to do, and every day that passed brought the conspirators closer to their goal. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. He was just one man, but he might be the only person who could stop a plot that would change the kingdom forever. The morning passed slowly, with Thomas watching every person who entered or left the council chamber. He memorized faces, tried to overhear conversations, and began to understand the full scope of what he was up against. This wasn't just a small group of disgruntled advisors. This was a carefully planned operation involving dozens of powerful people. As the day wore on, Thomas realized that his simple life as a palace guard was over. Whether he chose to act on what he knew or tried to ignore it, he could never go back to the way things were before. The secret he carried would either save the kingdom or destroy his family, and the choice of which outcome to pursue was entirely in his hands. 3 days passed, and Thomas found himself caught in an impossible situation. Every morning he put on his uniform and went to work, pretending everything was normal while carrying the weight of a secret that could destroy the kingdom. The conspiracy meetings continued daily in the council chamber, and Thomas could see the urgency growing among the participants. On Thursday morning, Thomas made his decision. He had to tell someone, and Captain Williams seemed like his best option. Williams had always been fair and honest, and more importantly, he had direct access to the king. If anyone could warn His Majesty about the plot, it would be the head of palace security. Thomas waited until his lunch break to approach Captain Williams's office. The captain was a tall, stern man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. He had earned his position through 20 years of dedicated service and was respected by everyone in the palace guard. "Captain Williams, sir," Thomas said, knocking on the open door. "Could I speak with you privately for a few minutes?" Williams looked up from the papers on his desk and studied Thomas's face. He could see immediately that something was troubling the younger man. In his experience, when good guards looked this worried, it usually meant serious trouble. "Of course, Thomas. Come in and close the door." Thomas entered the office and shut the door behind him, his heart pounding. This was the moment of no return. Once he shared what he knew, there would be no going back to his quiet, simple life. He sat down in the chair across from Williams's desk, trying to find the right words to begin. "Sir, I've discovered something that I believe poses a serious threat to His Majesty and the crown," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Williams leaned forward, his expression becoming even more serious. "What kind of threat?" Thomas took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He explained about the unusual activity in the East Wing, the late-night meeting, and how he had accidentally overheard the conversation from the hidden balcony above the council chamber. Williams listened without interruption, his face growing darker with each detail. When Thomas finished, Williams sat back in his chair, silent for several long minutes. Thomas could see the captain's mind working, processing the information and considering its implications. Finally, Williams spoke. "Thomas, these are very serious accusations. The men you've named are some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Lord Hamilton has been the king's economic advisor for 8 years. Sir Richard Wells has served 3 kings faithfully. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" "Yes, sir." "I know how it sounds, but I heard every word clearly. They're planning to overthrow His Majesty in less than 3 weeks, and they have General Morrison on their side. William stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard below. Thomas could see the conflict on the captain's face, the struggle between disbelief and the growing realization that the threat might be real. Thomas, if what you're telling me is true, then we're facing the greatest crisis this kingdom has seen in generations. But if you're wrong, or if you misunderstood what you heard, then making accusations against these men could destroy both of us. I understand, sir, but I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet and something happened to the king. Williams turned back to face Thomas, his decision made. I need you to tell me everything again, every detail you can remember. Names, exact words, anything that might help us understand the full scope of this plot. For the next hour, Thomas recounted everything he had seen and heard. Williams took careful notes, asking detailed questions about timing, voices, and specific phrases. When they finished, Williams had filled several pages with information about the conspiracy. Thomas, I want you to continue your normal duties, but I need you to be my eyes and ears in the East Wing. Don't do anything that would make the conspirators suspicious, but report anything unusual directly to me. Can you do that? Yes, sir. But what about the king? Shouldn't we warn him immediately? Williams considered this carefully. I need to verify some of this information first. If I walk into the king's private chambers with accusations against his closest advisors, based solely on what one guard overheard, he might not believe me. I need more evidence before I can approach His Majesty. Thomas understood the captain's position, but he felt frustrated by the delay. Every day that passed brought the conspirators closer to their goal. However, he also realized that Williams was right. They needed solid proof before making such serious accusations. That afternoon, Thomas returned to his post in the East Wing with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a guard doing his job. He was now part of an effort to save the crown. Williams had given him a small notebook where he could record observations and a special signal to use if he needed to communicate urgent information. The council chamber was busy again, with the same group of conspirators plus several new faces. Thomas recognized a few of them as wealthy businessmen who often visited the palace, but others were strangers. The conspiracy was clearly growing, adding new members as the planned date approached. During his shift, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the new participants in the meeting was Sir James Crawford, the king's personal secretary. Crawford had access to the king's schedule, his private correspondence, and his personal quarters. If he was part of the conspiracy, then the plotters knew everything about the king's daily activities. Thomas made a note about Crawford's involvement and continued his observations. He also noticed that the meetings were now happening twice a day, once in the morning and again in the evening. The frequency suggested that the timeline was being accelerated, possibly moving the planned overthrow to an even earlier date. When his shift ended, Thomas immediately went to report his new observations to Captain Williams. The captain was still in his office, studying maps and documents that Thomas recognized as palace security plans. Crawford is involved, Thomas reported. I saw him enter the council chamber this afternoon, and he stayed for over 2 hours. Williams closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. That's worse than I feared. Crawford knows the king's every move. If he's feeding information to the conspirators, then His Majesty is in immediate danger. What do we do now, sir? Williams stood up and walked to a secure filing cabinet, removing a thick folder. I've been checking the backgrounds of the men you identified, and I've found some disturbing connections. Lord Hamilton has been meeting secretly with foreign investors who have been critical of the king's economic policies. Sir Richard Wells has been in contact with military contractors who lost money when the king reduced defense spending. So it's not just about power, Thomas realized. It's about money too. Money and power usually go hand in hand, Williams replied grimly. But now I have enough evidence to approach the king. Thomas, I need you to understand something. Once I brief His Majesty about this threat, everything will change. The palace will go into lockdown. Arrests will be made, and there will be investigations that could last for months. Thomas thought about his family, about Emma's innocent questions over breakfast and Sarah's growing concern about his strange behavior. Sir, my wife and daughter, will they be safe? I'll make sure they're protected, Williams promised. In fact, I think it would be wise for them to visit relatives outside the city for a few weeks, just as a precaution. That evening, Thomas went home with his head spinning. The conspiracy was larger and more dangerous than he had initially realized, and now he was deeply involved in the effort to stop it. As he sat down to dinner with his family, he tried to act normal, but Sarah could see the tension in his face. "Thomas, you've been different all week," she said after Emma went upstairs to do her homework. "Please tell me what's wrong." Thomas looked at his wife's worried face and made another difficult decision. "Sarah, I need you to pack some clothes for you and Emma. I want you to visit your sister in the countryside for a few weeks." "What? Why, Thomas, what's happening?" "I can't explain everything right now, but there's a situation at the palace that could become dangerous. I need to know that you and Emma are somewhere safe." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Are you in trouble? Are we in danger?" Thomas took her hands in his. "Not if you leave tomorrow morning. Please, Sarah, trust me on this. Pack light and don't tell anyone where you're going except me." That night, as Sarah quietly packed their clothes, Thomas lay awake thinking about how much his life had changed in just 1 week. He had gone from being a simple palace guard to being a key witness in a plot against the crown. Tomorrow, Captain Williams would warn the king and everything would spiral into action. Thomas thought about the choice he had made to speak up instead of staying silent. He could have ignored what he heard, continued his normal routine, and hoped that someone else would discover the plot. But his conscience wouldn't let him take that path. Now, for better or worse, he was committed to seeing this through to the end. As he listened to Sarah moving around their bedroom, preparing for an uncertain future, Thomas prayed that he had made the right decision. The fate of the kingdom might depend on the actions of one guard who had heard too much, and the weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. But there was no turning back now. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Thomas's mood as he watched Sarah and Emma prepare to leave for the countryside. Emma was excited about the unexpected trip to see her aunt, chattering about all the things she wanted to do on the farm. Sarah, however, could barely hide her fear and confusion about the sudden departure. "Daddy, why can't you come with us?" Emma asked as she hugged him goodbye at the front door. "I have important work to do at the palace, sweetheart," Thomas replied, kneeling down to her level. "But I'll come visit you soon, I promise." Sarah kissed him goodbye, her eyes searching his face for answers he couldn't give her. "Be careful, Thomas. Whatever's happening, please be careful." "I will," he promised, watching as they got into the taxi that would take them to the train station. As the car disappeared around the corner, Thomas felt a deep sadness settle over him. He didn't know when he would see his family again, or what condition the kingdom would be in when he did. At the palace, Thomas reported for duty, knowing that this would be a day unlike any other. Captain Williams had arranged to meet with the king at 10 o'clock in the morning, during a brief break in His Majesty's schedule. The weight of the approaching confrontation hung over both men like a storm cloud. Thomas took his position in the East Wing, trying to maintain his normal routine, while watching for any signs that the conspirators suspected their plan had been discovered. The council chamber was busy again, with Lord Hamilton arriving early and several other key figures following soon after. Their behavior seemed urgent but not panicked, which suggested they still believed their secret was safe. At exactly 10 o'clock, Thomas saw Captain Williams walking toward the king's private chambers, carrying a briefcase full of evidence. Thomas's heart was pounding as he watched the captain disappear through the ornate doors that led to the royal quarters. Everything depended on how the king reacted to the news about the conspiracy. For the next hour, Thomas tried to focus on his duties while his mind raced with possibilities. Would the king believe Captain Williams? Would he order immediate arrests, or would he want more evidence? How would the conspirators react when they realized their plot had been exposed? At 11:15, Captain Williams emerged from the king's chambers, his face grim but determined. He caught Thomas's eye and gave a subtle nod, the signal they had agreed upon to indicate that the king had been informed and was taking action. Relief flooded through Thomas, followed immediately by new anxiety about what would happen next. The morning passed slowly, with Thomas watching every person who entered or left the council chamber. The conspirators seemed to be conducting business as usual, unaware that their activities were now being monitored by the king himself. Thomas wondered how long it would be before the arrests began. Just after lunch, everything changed. Thomas was standing at his usual post when he saw a group of palace guards he didn't recognize walking through the East Wing. They were dressed in the uniform of the Royal Protection Unit, the elite force responsible for the king's personal security. Their presence in the East Wing could only mean one thing: the operation against the conspirators was beginning. The leader of the group approached Thomas and showed him an official order signed by the king. "We're here to secure the council chamber and detain everyone inside for questioning. You're to maintain your post and ensure no one enters or leaves this corridor." Thomas nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. After days of watching and waiting, the moment of truth had finally arrived. He took his position at the corridor entrance while the Royal Protection Unit surrounded the council chamber. Inside the chamber, the conspirators were conducting what they thought was another routine planning meeting. Lord Hamilton was speaking about financial arrangements while Sir Richard Wells discussed political strategy. They had no idea that armed guards were positioning themselves outside their doors. At exactly 2 o'clock, the guards moved. Thomas heard the council chamber doors burst open, followed by shouts of surprise and confusion from inside. The voices he had been secretly listening to for days were now raised in panic and protest. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Hamilton's voice echoed through the corridor. "By order of His Majesty the King, you are all under arrest for conspiracy against the Crown," the unit leader announced. Thomas watched as the conspirators were led out of the chamber in handcuffs. Lord Hamilton looked shocked and indignant, while Sir Richard Wells appeared pale and frightened. Sir James Crawford, the King's personal secretary, seemed resigned to his fate, as if he had been expecting this moment. But as the arrests continued, Thomas realized that not all of the conspirators were present. Several key figures, including the man with the cold voice who had dominated the conversations Thomas overheard, were nowhere to be seen. Either they had been warned, or they were smart enough to stay away from the palace when the operation began. Captain Williams appeared at Thomas's side as the last of the arrested conspirators was led away. "Good work, Thomas. Your courage in coming forward has saved the kingdom from a terrible fate. But some of them got away," Thomas observed. "The man with the cold voice wasn't here, and I don't think we got everyone." Williams nodded grimly. "You're right. We've arrested the leaders who were present, but there are others still out there. General Morrison has disappeared from his headquarters, and several wealthy businessmen who were part of the plot have suddenly left the country." Thomas felt a chill of fear. "Does that mean it's not over?" "The immediate threat to the king has been neutralized," Williams explained. "But you're right that it's not completely over. The remaining conspirators might try to regroup, or they might simply flee and try to avoid prosecution. Either way, we'll need to remain vigilant." As the afternoon progressed, Thomas learned more about the scope of the operation. The arrests weren't limited to the palace. Simultaneous raids were being conducted at the homes and offices of suspected conspirators throughout the city. The investigation had revealed that the plot was even larger than anyone had imagined, involving corrupt officials, foreign agents, and criminal organizations. The king himself appeared in the East Wing later that afternoon, accompanied by his personal security detail. Thomas had never been this close to His Majesty before, and he was struck by how tired and sad the king looked. The betrayal by his closest advisors had clearly taken a heavy toll on him. "Captain Williams tells me that you're the guard who discovered this conspiracy," the king said, approaching Thomas. "Yes, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, bowing respectfully. "Your loyalty and courage have saved not just my life, but the stability of our entire kingdom. I want you to know that your service will never be forgotten." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the king's gratitude, but also burdened by the knowledge that the danger wasn't completely over. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I only did what I felt was right." "That's exactly what makes you a true guardian of the crown," the king replied. "Captain Williams has recommended you for promotion to the Royal Protection Unit. Are you interested?" The offer was unexpected and generous, but Thomas found himself thinking about his family. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to consider my wife and daughter's safety. If the remaining conspirators are still out there, I understand your concern," the king said. "That's why I'm also offering protection for your family and a new identity if you choose to accept it. Men like you are rare, Thomas, and the crown needs people we can trust completely." As the king walked away, Thomas felt the weight of another difficult decision. The promotion would mean better pay and more prestige, but it would also mean greater danger for his family. The remaining conspirators would certainly want revenge against the man who had exposed their plot. That evening, Thomas called Sarah at her sister's house to check on her and Emma. He couldn't tell her about the arrests or the king's offer over the phone, but he needed to hear her voice and know that they were safe. "When can we come home?" Sarah asked. "Not yet," Thomas replied, "but I hope it will be soon." "How's Emma doing?" "She's having a wonderful time with the animals, but she misses you." "We both do." After hanging up, Thomas sat alone in his empty house thinking about the events of the day. The immediate crisis was over, but new challenges lay ahead. The kingdom had been saved from one threat, but the remaining conspirators were still out there, planning their next move. Thomas realized that his simple life as a palace guard was truly over now. Whether he accepted the king's offer to join the Royal Protection Unit or tried to return to his old position, he would always be the man who had exposed the conspiracy. That knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life, bringing both honor and danger in equal measure. As he prepared for bed, Thomas thought about the choice that had started it all. His decision to investigate the unusual activity in the East Wing instead of simply ignoring it. That choice had led him down a path he never could have imagined, changing not just his own life but the fate of the entire kingdom. Tomorrow would bring new decisions and new challenges. But tonight, Thomas allowed himself to feel proud of what he had accomplished. He had heard too much, but instead of staying silent, he had chosen to speak up. That choice had made all the difference. 2 weeks after the arrests, Thomas discovered that his troubles were far from over. While the main conspiracy had been exposed and its leaders were in prison awaiting trial, the remaining conspirators had not given up. They had simply changed their strategy from overthrowing the king to eliminating the man who had ruined their plans. Thomas first realized he was being watched on a Tuesday morning as he walked to work. A man in a dark coat had been standing across from his house when he left, and Thomas noticed the same man following him at a distance as he made his way to the palace. When Thomas stopped to buy a newspaper, the man pretended to look in a shop window. When Thomas crossed the street, the man did the same a few minutes later. At the palace, Thomas reported the surveillance to Captain Williams, who immediately assigned additional security to watch Thomas's house and monitor his daily routes. The captain's face was grim as he delivered more disturbing news. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that there's a price on your head," Williams explained. "The remaining conspirators have apparently hired professional criminals to silence you permanently." Thomas felt his blood turn cold. "What about my family? Are Sarah and Emma safe where they are?" "For now, yes. We have agents watching your sister-in-law's farm, and we haven't detected any threats in that area. But Thomas, I think it's time to seriously consider the king's offer. The Royal Protection Unit can provide better security for both you and your family." Thomas had been avoiding making a decision about the promotion, hoping that life would somehow return to normal. Now he realized that normal no longer existed for him. The men he had helped arrest would spend years in prison, and their associates would never forgive him for destroying their plans. "If I joined the Royal Protection Unit, what would that mean for my family?" Thomas asked. "Complete relocation under new identities," Williams replied. "New names, new backgrounds, new life in a different part of the kingdom. It's not ideal, but it's the only way to guarantee your safety." The thought of giving up everything, their home, their friends, their entire life, was devastating to Thomas. But the alternative might be death, not just for him but potentially for Sarah and Emma as well. That evening, he called his wife to discuss their options. "Sarah, I need to tell you something important," he began, and then explained everything that had happened: the conspiracy, the arrests, and the current threats against their family. Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but determined. "Thomas, I married you because you're a good man who always tries to do the right thing. If you hadn't spoken up about what you heard, innocent people might have been hurt. I'm proud of you, even if it means our lives have to change. But Emma," Thomas said, "she'll have to leave her school, her friends, everything she knows." "Children are more resilient than adults," Sarah replied. "She'll adapt, and she'll grow up knowing that her father is a hero." The next morning, Thomas met with the king again to formally accept the promotion and the protection program. His Majesty looked relieved when Thomas agreed to join the Royal Protection Unit. "I know this isn't easy for you," the king said, "but your experience with the conspiracy makes you uniquely valuable to our security efforts. We need people who understand how these plots develop and who have the courage to act when they discover threats." Over the following days, Thomas underwent intensive training with the Royal Protection Unit. The work was more demanding than his previous duties, requiring advanced combat skills, intelligence analysis, and counterterrorism techniques. But Thomas found that he had a natural aptitude for the work, particularly for detecting suspicious behavior and identifying potential threats. Meanwhile, preparations were being made for his family's relocation. Government agents were creating new identities for all three of them, complete with detailed background stories and supporting documentation. Thomas Miller would become Thomas Anderson, a security specialist transferred from another district. Sarah would become Susan Anderson and Emma would be Eva Anderson. The hardest part was saying goodbye to their old life. Thomas spent his last evening in their house on Maple Street, walking through the rooms where he and Sarah had been so happy, where Emma had taken her first steps and spoken her first words. Every corner held memories that he would have to leave behind forever. 3 weeks after accepting the promotion, Thomas traveled to the countryside to collect his family and begin their new life. The reunion with Sarah and Emma was emotional. They hadn't seen each other in over a month, and the stress of the situation had taken its toll on all of them. "Daddy, Aunt Margaret says we're going to live somewhere new," Emma said as she hugged him tightly. "Is that true?" "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to have a new adventure in a beautiful place where we'll be safe and happy." Emma seemed excited by the prospect, but Thomas could see the worry in Sarah's eyes. She understood better than their daughter how completely their lives were about to change. The journey to their new home took most of a day, traveling by car through countryside and small towns that Thomas had never seen before. Their destination was a quiet village called Millbrook, about 300 miles from the capital. It was surrounded by rolling hills and forests, far from the political intrigue and danger of the palace. Their new house was larger than their old one, with a garden that Emma immediately fell in love with. The government had provided everything they needed to start fresh: furniture, clothes, even toys for Emma that were similar to the ones she had left behind. Thomas's new position was with a regional security office that monitored potential threats throughout the district. On the surface, it appeared to be a routine administrative job, but Thomas knew that he was actually part of an intelligence network that reported directly to the Royal Protection Unit. The first few months in Millbrook were difficult. Emma adapted quickly, making new friends at school and exploring the countryside with the enthusiasm of childhood. But Sarah struggled with the isolation and the constant awareness that they were living under false identities. Thomas found it hard to adjust to the deception required by their new life, having to remember their false background stories and never mentioning anything about their real past. But gradually, they began to build a new routine. Thomas discovered that he enjoyed his intelligence work, using the skills he had developed to identify and track potential threats to the kingdom's security. Sarah found work at the local library, where her love of books and her natural kindness made her popular with the residents. Emma thrived in her new school, where she was known as a bright, cheerful girl whose father worked in security. 6 months after their relocation, Captain Williams visited them in Millbrook. He brought news about the conspiracy trials and updates on the remaining threats against Thomas's safety. Most of the captured conspirators have been convicted and sentenced to long prison terms, Williams reported. Lord Hamilton received 20 years for treason, and Sir Richard Wells got 15 years. Sir James Crawford cooperated with the investigation and received a lighter sentence. "What about the ones who escaped?" Thomas asked. "General Morrison was found dead in a foreign country, apparently killed by his own associates who blamed him for the conspiracy's failure. Several of the businessmen involved have been arrested by international authorities and will be extradited to face trial." Williams's visit also brought an unexpected honor. The king had decided to award Thomas the Medal of Distinguished Service, the highest decoration available to palace security personnel. The ceremony would be held privately, with only a few trusted officials present to protect Thomas's new identity. "Your actions saved the kingdom," Williams said as he presented the medal. "But more than that, they showed that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they have the courage to do what's right." As Williams prepared to leave, he had one final piece of news. "The threats against you have diminished significantly. Most of the people who wanted revenge are either dead, in prison, or have fled the country. We believe you and your family are safe now." That evening, Thomas sat in his garden with Sarah and Emma, watching the sunset over the hills surrounding Millbrook. It had been almost a year since he first overheard the conspiracy meeting. and his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Speaking up about what you heard?" Thomas considered the question carefully. They had lost their old life, their home, their identities. They could never go back to being the people they used to be. But they had also gained something valuable, the knowledge that they had helped save their kingdom from a terrible fate. "No," he said finally. "I could never have lived with myself if I had stayed silent and let those men succeed. What we lost was just things and places. What we saved was our integrity and our country's freedom." Emma, who had been quietly playing with her toys, looked up at her parents. "Daddy, will you tell me the story again about how you helped the king?" Thomas smiled and pulled his daughter onto his lap. The story had become a favorite bedtime tale, though he always told it as if it were about someone else, a brave guard who discovered a plot and saved the kingdom through his courage and loyalty. As he began the familiar story, 5 years had passed since Thomas Miller became Thomas Anderson, and life in Millbrook had settled into a peaceful rhythm that felt almost normal. Emma, now 13, had grown into a confident teenager who loved her life in the countryside. She was captain of her school's debate team and had never shown any curiosity about why her family had moved to the village when she was 8. To her, Millbrook was simply home. Sarah had become an integral part of the community, organizing book clubs at the library and volunteering at local charity events. She had made genuine friends who knew her as Susan Anderson, the kind librarian with the gentle smile and the security specialist husband. The weight of living under a false identity had gradually lessened as their new life became their real life. Thomas continued his work with the regional security office, but his role had evolved over the years. His experience with the palace conspiracy had made him an expert on identifying and preventing plots against the government. He now trained other security personnel and served as a consultant on cases involving potential threats to the crown. On a crisp autumn morning, Thomas received a call that would once again change everything. Captain Williams, now promoted to Director of Royal Security, was on the line with urgent news. "Thomas, we need your help," Williams said without preamble. "We've uncovered evidence of a new conspiracy, and it appears to be connected to the plot you exposed 5 years ago." Thomas felt a familiar chill run down his spine. "What kind of evidence?" "Financial records showing payments to foreign operatives, communications referencing unfinished business, and most concerning of all, surveillance photos of you and your family taken within the last month." The news hit Thomas like a physical blow. After 5 years of peace, the past was reaching out to threaten his family again. "Are Sarah and Emma in immediate danger?" "We don't believe so, but we can't be certain. The surveillance suggests that someone has found you, despite all our security measures. We need you to come to the capital immediately so we can assess the threat and plan our response." Thomas looked out his office window at the quiet village street, knowing that his peaceful life in Millbrook was about to end. "I'll need to tell my family." "Bring them with you," Williams advised. "Until we understand the scope of this new threat, it's safer to have everyone under our direct protection." That evening, Thomas sat down with Sarah and Emma to explain that they would need to take another unexpected trip. He couldn't tell them the full truth, that their new identities had been compromised, and that they might be in danger, but he needed them to understand the seriousness of the situation. "The government needs my help. With a special security matter," he explained carefully. "We'll need to stay in the capital for a while, maybe several weeks." Emma was disappointed about missing school and her friends, but she was also excited about visiting the big city. Sarah, however, could read the worry in Thomas's eyes and knew that this was more than just a work assignment. "How long have you known this was coming?" she asked after Emma went upstairs to pack. "I got the call this morning," Thomas replied. "But Sarah, there are things about our past that might be catching up with us. I can't give you details, but I need you to trust me when I say we have to be very careful." The next morning, they drove to the capital under the protection of 2 unmarked security vehicles. Thomas watched the countryside pass by, remembering the last time they had made this journey in reverse, fleeing from danger toward a new life. Now they were returning to face whatever threats had emerged from the shadows of their past. At the capital, they were taken to a secure government facility where Thomas was reunited with Director Williams. The man had aged considerably in the 5 years since they had last met. and Thomas could see the stress of his position written in the lines around his eyes. "The situation is more serious than I indicated on the phone," Williams began without pleasantries. "We've discovered that the son of General Morrison, the military officer who was part of the original conspiracy, has been working for several years to rebuild his father's network." "I thought Morrison was killed by his own associates," Thomas said. "He was, but apparently his son Marcus blamed you for his father's death, rather than the conspirators who actually killed him. Marcus Morrison has spent the last 5 years gathering information about everyone involved in exposing the original plot. He found you 3 months ago." Williams showed Thomas surveillance photos that made his blood run cold. Pictures of Emma walking to school, Sarah working in the library, Thomas himself leaving their house in Millbrook. Someone had been watching his family for months without them knowing it. "What does he want?" Thomas asked. "Revenge, primarily. But we also have evidence that he's trying to complete his father's original mission. He's been in contact with foreign governments that would benefit from destabilizing our kingdom, and he's recruited several former military officers who were loyal to his father." Thomas studied the intelligence reports Williams provided, recognizing the same patterns he had learned to identify 5 years earlier: secret meetings, financial irregularities, communications with foreign agents. It was the same type of conspiracy, just with different players. "You want me to help stop him," Thomas realized. "You're the only person who has successfully infiltrated and exposed a conspiracy of this type," Williams confirmed. "We need your expertise, and frankly, we need you as bait." The plan Williams outlined was dangerous but elegant. Thomas would return to his duties at the palace, using his promotion to the Royal Protection Unit as cover for investigating the new conspiracy. Marcus Morrison would likely try to make contact with him, either to recruit him or to eliminate him, and that contact would give the security forces an opportunity to capture the entire network. "What about my family?" Thomas asked. "They'll remain here under protection while you're working." "I know it's not ideal, but it's the safest option until we've neutralized the threat." That evening, Thomas explained the situation to Sarah as carefully as he could. He told her about his role in exposing a conspiracy 5 years earlier, about their relocation under new identities, and about the current threat from people seeking revenge. Sarah listened quietly, her face growing pale as she began to understand the full scope of what Thomas had been keeping from her. When he finished, she was silent for several minutes. "You saved the kingdom," she said finally, "and now they want you to save it again." "I don't have to," Thomas replied. "We could ask for permanent relocation to another country. We could disappear completely and start over somewhere else." Sarah looked at him with the same expression she had worn 5 years earlier when he first asked her to trust him. "Thomas, if you don't help stop these people, how many other families will they hurt? How many innocent people will suffer if their plan succeeds? But what about Emma? What about our life together? Emma will be proud of her father when she's old enough to understand what he did. And our life together will mean more if we know we helped protect other people's lives too." 3 days later, Thomas returned to the palace for the first time in 5 years. Walking through the familiar corridors brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad. He was assigned to the same East Wing where he had first discovered the original conspiracy. But now he was there as an investigator rather than an accidental witness. The new conspiracy was more sophisticated than the first one. Marcus Morrison had learned from his father's mistakes, using more secure communication methods and recruiting people who were less likely to attract attention. But Thomas had also learned from experience, and he knew what signs to look for. Within a week, Thomas had identified several suspicious individuals and patterns of behavior that suggested the conspiracy was further along than anyone had realized. Marcus Morrison was planning to strike during the upcoming state celebration, when the palace would be filled with foreign dignitaries and the security arrangements would be at their most complex. Thomas's investigation led him deeper into a web of corruption and foreign influence that stretched throughout the government and military. But as he gathered evidence, he also realized that Marcus Morrison was aware of his activities and was planning something specifically targeting him. The confrontation, when it came, was both personal and political. Marcus Morrison arranged to meet Thomas privately, ostensibly to recruit him but actually to eliminate the man he blamed for destroying his family. The meeting took place in the same council chamber where Thomas had first overheard the original conspiracy 5 years earlier. "You destroyed my father," Morrison said as they faced each other across the room where his father had once plotted against the crown. "Your father destroyed himself when he chose to betray his oath," Thomas replied calmly. "I just made sure his betrayal didn't succeed." The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of Morrison's plan and his network of supporters. But it also revealed something else. Thomas had grown from a simple guard who accidentally discovered a conspiracy into a skilled security professional who could hold his own against experienced opponents. When the confrontation ended, Morrison was in custody, and his conspiracy was broken. The evidence Thomas had gathered led to arrests throughout the kingdom and exposed foreign interference in the nation's affairs. Once again, his actions had prevented a catastrophe that could have destroyed the stability of the realm. But this time, the aftermath was different. The king personally thanked Thomas and offered him a permanent position as director of counterintelligence, with full recognition of his service and no need for false identities. Thomas's family could return to their real names and live openly in the capital, protected by their status rather than hidden by secrecy. As Thomas considered the offer, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. From a simple palace guard who overheard too much to a security professional trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive operations, it had been a path he never could have imagined when he first put on his uniform 12 years earlier. But most importantly, he thought about his family and the life they had built together despite all the challenges and changes. Sarah and Emma had supported him through everything, trusting him to make the right choices even when those choices were difficult and dangerous. In the end, Thomas accepted the king's offer, but with one condition: he wanted to split his time between the capital and Millbrook, maintaining the connections to the peaceful village life that had given his family such happiness. The king agreed, understanding that a man who had sacrificed so much for his country deserved to have some control over his own destiny. Years later, as Thomas told the complete story to Emma on her 18th birthday, he reflected on the lesson he had learned. Sometimes hearing too much isn't a burden, but an opportunity. The choice to act on what you know, rather than staying silent out of fear or convenience, can change not just your own life but the lives of everyone around you. Thomas Miller had heard too much that night 5 years ago, but his decision to speak up had saved a kingdom and protected countless innocent people. It was a legacy he could be proud of, and a story worth telling to the next generation who would face their own choices between safety and service, between silence and courage.